I'll introduce our speaker, Dr. Molly Womack, but I'm going to give a pitch for our next talk in the series, and this will be one by Dr. Suzanne Janicki of the USU Geosciences Department, and it'll be Cache Valley's Ancient Floods and Earthquakes. And earthquakes are much in the news with the tragedy in Turkey and Syria, and we also have a new earthquake center that is going to be built here at USU in the next year or so. And of course, earthquakes are a major worry for all of us here in Cache Valley. So please turn out for the April 14th talk on earthquakes and floods in Cache Valley. A few shout outs to some new volunteers for this Science Unwrapped. We have USU Honors here for the first time. We have the Fluid Dynamics Lab with a table. There is the AMS Graduate Student Chapter. We have the First Presbyterian Church Youth Group. We have the Robotics Lab here tonight. And last but not least, we have Molly Womack's lab here. It has 3 tables. So again, take advantage of those activities. Let me introduce Molly Womack. So Dr. Molly Womack. Her talk tonight is Croaky Shapeshifters, How Frogs Shapeshift Within a Lifetime Across Millennia. And before I go too far, I took my jacket off to show green. It's St. Patrick's Day. Okay, many frogs are green. All right, so we have some tie-ins over here, but happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody. I'm going to give you the standard things, then I'll go a little bit off script. So the standard things are where Molly received her various degrees because she is a highly educated scientist. Okay, Molly got her Bachelor's of Science from the University of Florida. She got a PhD in zoology from Colorado State University, a sister school of ours. She did an NSF-sponsored postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California, Berkeley, and the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. And that sounds like 2 separate things, but they're pretty closely tied together in that postdoc. She is a Peter Buck postdoctoral fellow, or was a Peter Buck postdoctoral fellow, at the National Museum of Natural History in Washington. And then she is a Secretary's Distinguished Fellow of the I can't get these words out. These are not hard. National Museum of Natural History, to the ends there, and again in Washington, D.C. She has been with us here at USU as an assistant professor of biology since 2020. We're really delighted to have Molly in the biology department. So let me tell you a few informal things. I'll tell you in a moment how I came to know Molly, but a few interesting things with Molly. In addition to her deep interest in all things kind of green and jumpy out there in the field, Molly was an avid soccer player all through her pre-high school years and high school years, and in fact, she tells me she really wasn't that interested in science at all until she got to college, and then suddenly saw the light. I think Molly's still really interested in soccer, right? Okay. Molly grew up in Oklahoma, in Florida, and one thing really important to know about Molly is deeply passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly about LGBTQ plus issues. So Molly really is an advocate for all things, in those groups. And it's I think, an important part of who Molly is. I came to know Molly actually in her job interview, and I intensely annoyed a colleague of mine who was with me when we took Molly out to breakfast. And I did that annoyance by finding speaking with Molly so fascinating and so interesting. You probably have no recollection of that conversation at all, do you? But we had a great time. We had food be darned, We just talked about all things related to evolution and development, and the intersection of evolution and development. I think my colleague felt really left out, and I couldn't understand when we were walking back why he didn't say a word to me, and had this really sour look in his face, and I eventually figured it out, But anyway, Molly's research interest, and she's been really active in research since she's been with us, is, and I've got this written down here over here, but I'll be darned if I can find it, but it's both a use of field research and lab-based research to look at both traits and functions among different species, and to understand how biodiversity develops, specifically by looking at both the development of organisms and the evolutionary history of those organisms and the intersection of those things. And most importantly, I think, why it matters. So, without further ado, because I've been up here long enough, let me introduce Dr. Molly Womack of the USU Biology Department. Talk about shapeshifters over here. And her talk is Croaky Shapeshifters, How Frogs Shapeshift Within a Lifetime and Across Millennia. So thanks, Molly.
Thank you, Greg. I do remember that breakfast, and I didn't know why your colleague wasn't speaking that much. So thank you for finally telling me.
Quite upset.
Yeah. So my name's Molly, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do, but also what my whole lab does. And then you're going to have the chance to go outside these doors and interact with us and actually see at least some things about what we do in our research. So I'm an evolutionary biologist and a herpetologist. So what does that mean? So the evolutionary biologist part means that I study how all life is connected. So all life is connected through this process of evolution and through many kind of things that we can find that are common among different living things, including us and everything else like bacteria or insects or fish, or what I like to study, frogs. And I also, on the flip side, study what makes all these living things a little bit different from one another. I'm also a herpetologist, so what that part means is I usually am thinking about critters that look like this. So usually I'm thinking about things like snakes or alligators or salamanders or frogs, all these things that fall into this herpetofauna group. But usually my whole lab studies frogs. So we really tend to focus on the frogs. So here are some frogs from some recent photos. I'm notoriously bad at taking selfies, and I think this is evidence of that. So that's a few years ago, and that's just a few months ago in the field picking up frogs from all over the world. And so when we bring these things together, basically what I do is I study all the many species of frogs. There's over 7,500 different species of frogs, and I study how many frogs there are. I study what makes them all very similar, and I study what makes them each unique and different from one another. Why frogs? They're pretty cool. I think they're pretty cool for a number of reasons. One, as Greg alluded to, it's St. Patrick's Day, so we can't avoid the fact that, a lot of frogs are green. So that sort of fits in here. And in fact, some frogs are so green, this isn't all frogs, but some frogs, like this frog, so green that its bones are actually green too. So you can actually see the bones in this frog, and those are actually colored green, and its blood is also green. So this is a very, very green frog. But I don't want you walking away thinking all frogs are green. So it's important to remember that frogs can be many, many, many colors. Basically every color in the rainbow, you can find a frog that color. They're a really diverse and really beautiful group of frogs. And also, some frogs don't have any color at all. So here's a really gorgeous frog. These are called the glass frogs because they're see-through. And so you can actually see straight through their skin, and then you can see that they have some eggs right here on the right. Those little green balls are the eggs that are going to turn into little baby frogs. You can see the heart up there in red, and you can actually see it beating in real time. Okay, so that's what frogs look like from the outside, but the other cool thing about frogs is they start out looking not like what you think of as frogs. So they have this whole time in their life where they live underwater, and some look like this. They're small, and you can find them in ponds. Some look like this, and they live in super fast-flowing streams, and they use their mouths to stick onto rocks, and so they can stay in these waterfall areas. They can do all sorts of cool things, so they can swim around, but you can see this one up here climbing out of this bucket. And some of them even get mistaken for fish. So these are a pretty common frog that you can find in lots of different places. And often when people catch these, they think they're catching small catfish. But that's actually a frog. So one thing that my lab does is we look at these developing frogs, which we call tadpoles. And Jack, who's pictured up here, he's doing a lot of cool research on tadpoles, and he has a high-speed video out back. So when we're done here, he can show you how he studies these up close and personal, and you can see how our high-speed video camera works. That's a really big tadpole, by the way, about 10 centimeters. So that's like a really, really honking tadpole. So then frogs do this really weird thing where they turn from a tadpole and they grow legs and they move on to land, or at least most of them do. They move from water to land. And this is a really wild process that we call metamorphosis. And you can think about this as basically the most extreme puberty that you can think of. So this all happens in a very short amount of time, usually just a couple of days, so they can spend weeks or months or even years as this tadpole, and then in just a couple of days, they turn into a frog. And then once they're a frog, most frogs look more or less the same. There's this kind of famous saying, a frog is a frog is a frog. And people say this because you kind of know when you have a frog. They all have the same sort of looking body, and you aren't usually going to mistake a frog for anything else once it's an adult. But I would like to push back a little bit on this very famous saying, because I think there's a lot of interesting variation among frogs, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that today. So, we're going to talk a little bit about how frogs communicate and how frogs view their world. So if you think about the different senses, if you think right now about all these different ways you sense your world, if you had to pick one of these senses that you would say you use the most when you're communicating, talking with your family and friends, which one of these would you say you use most? So raise your hand if you use smell most to communicate with your family and friends. Very bold. I would hope there would be one. That's amazing. That makes me rethink everything. Taste. Who thinks they use taste? Kind of repeat voter back here. I like it. Who thinks they use hearing a lot when they're talking, communicating? Okay. Touch? Yeah, a lot of us use touch. What about vision? All right, maybe the most for vision, but a bunch for hearing. So we're going to talk a lot about this one. We're going to talk a lot about hearing, because a lot of different animals really use what we call acoustic communication or sound to communicate with one another. So we use it. Obviously, I'm using it right now. I'm talking to you, you're listening, or at least pretending to listen and being very nice about it. But all these other organisms also use sound. So fish make sound and communicate to one another with sound. Crickets you can hear, bats, everything basic. Most animals you can think of usually use some form of sound, and my favorite, of course, the frogs. So frogs use sound a lot. So you've probably heard frogs before you've seen frogs in most cases. So if you go to a pond, here's some recent field work. Those are all frogs. You can hear a bunch of different clicks and clacks. This frog is, you can see its vocal sac. It's not actively calling, but all the frogs around it are. You can hear them loud in the background. So usually these really loud calls that you hear at ponds, they're used to basically call out like you would to a friend or family to say like, hey, come over here, I want to talk to you. Sometimes frogs do use sound to tell people or tell other animals to go away. So here's good. That's an amazing video that Jack took in the field. And let's see this one. So occasionally they use sound to try to get an animal to go away, but but often when we hear frogs making noise, it is in this way of talking to one another, just like we do, to try to communicate with each other. So that means frogs must have pretty good hearing, and usually they do. So frogs have ears. They don't have this part that sticks out like we do, but if you pick up a frog anywhere here in Utah, you're going to see a little circle right here behind the eye, just kind of where you find your ear. And this is a thin membrane that picks up sound. You actually have one too. It's just hidden away inside your ear canal. And this is what transfers sound into what we call your inner ear inside your skull, and this lets you sense the acoustic world or the sound world around you. So a calling frog or toad or any sound can hit this thin membrane and it causes it to move, and that sends those vibrations into your skull, where eventually some kind of fancy ear equipment sends those signals to your brain. And basically any animal that lives on land has a backbone and has 4 limbs, like us, has one of these ears, or some version of it. So all amphibians, which include frogs, these ears arose around over 200 million years ago. All the kind of reptiles and birds, they also have ears pretty similar to this. Some are a little bit modified, but they have these same general parts I just showed you. And mammals, where we sit, also have these ears, and we are, of course, in this group over here. So this is how basically every animal that has a backbone that lives on land senses sound. So frogs are really no different from us in that way. But what I study is kind of this fun story of a bunch of frogs that lack these ears. So there are a lot of frogs that actually have none of these parts. None of these parts of the ear that we use, that you're using to hear me right now. They've lost them. And this basically means that sound that hits their head hits a brick wall and just bounces right off. So they can't actually hear sound, or they shouldn't be able to hear sound as well as we do. And these earless frogs that we call, they're everywhere. So everywhere where you see blue on this map, you can find an earless frog. So they're all over the place. None here in Utah, unfortunately, but we only have a few species. Yeah? That is a great question, and I promise you I will answer some of it. Okay. I'm happy to answer questions as we go. So these frogs, I should also mention, they live in all sorts of different environments. So some live in deserts, some near waterfalls, some in these kind of low montane streams, some in these kind of high montane, high elevation cloud forests. So frogs are found all over the world in all sorts of different looking places. They also look really different from one another. So earless frogs don't all look alike. So they're lacking that ear, they're lacking that circle behind the eye, but some are pretty big and have these huge crests and look kind of warty like a toad. Some are these beautiful, beautiful harlequin toads that are brightly colored. And some look like this. This is the pumpkin toadlet, which I think you can understand why it got its name. It's very, very small, and I'm going to show a very adorable video of it later in this presentation, I promise. So, what can earless frogs hear? So they don't have their ear. What can they hear? That's something that I studied for when I was getting my PhD. And it's hard to get, has anyone in here done a hearing test? Yeah, so usually how this works is you kind of put on headphones and then someone asks you when you can hear a noise. So you'll put on headphones and then they'll play beeps and boops. And then they'll ask you, when can you hear it? Raise your hand. Frogs and toads, notoriously bad at behaving in a way that you want them to. So it's hard for us to communicate with them. It's easy for them to communicate with each other, but it's hard to ask them that question of what they can hear. But there's a really nifty way that we can actually go out and test the hearing of these frogs right where they live. And it's actually super similar to the way hearing tests are done in newborn babies. So sometimes to double check the hearing of a newborn baby, you'll put patches just here and here, as you see in this photo, and play a noise. And then those patches actually pick up electrical signals that are being sent to your brain and let you know, like, oh, the ear is picking up this sound. And we essentially can do the same thing in these frogs and toads. So doing this, I was able to show that this maybe isn't that surprising. These earless frogs, they don't hear as well as the frogs that do have ears. But just how bad is their hearing? So I'm going to play a little bit of music that shows how bad their hearing is. So first I'm going to play this music like normal, like an eared frog would hear it. Okay, so that's normal eared frog Lizzo. And then I'm going to play you earless frog Lizzo. And so you can hear that, basically you can hear really low frequencies. It kind of sounds like you're underwater. But you miss all these high frequencies. So all these really nice frequencies that Lizzo's so good at hitting that I could never hit in song. But what does this mean for the frogs? Because they probably don't spend most of their time listening to Lizzo. It basically means that these earless frogs can't hear very far. So they can only hear really low sounds, and they can't hear very far. So if an earless frog can hear some sound at those higher frequencies, an eared frog could hear that same sound from 4 to 16 times the distance. So they can hear someone trying to get their attention from really far away, and the earless frog can't. They also can't hear predators or something that might be coming to try to make them a snack. And so this could have really big consequences for basically them surviving out in the world. So this is kind of a mystery. Why are earless frogs losing their ears? Why don't they have their ears? And I think, from the flip side, we can think about what are we learning from these earless frogs? What are these earless frogs trying to tell us? Because we make a lot of assumptions when we go out into the world that we hear these frogs calling, and therefore that's super important to them. But these earless frogs might be telling us something else, something we're missing. So one thing that our lab is finding is that not all frogs are calling as much as we think they are. So most frogs have these big vocal sacs, shown in this nice photo here, and this helps them call really fast and really loud. And these vocal sacs can look really strange, so they can come in all shapes. Some have two. They can be almost bigger than the body of the frog themselves sometimes. It can be really wild. And if we look at the relationships, so this is looking at basically how many times we see frogs losing ears. We can look across this evolutionary tree, which shows all the connected branches of all the different frogs that we know whether they have ears or not. And all these blue arrows indicate a time in evolutionary history where frogs lost their ears. And there's a lot of blue arrows. These frogs are losing their ears left and right. But there's also a lot of frogs that are losing this vocal sac. So they're also losing this calling structure just as much, if not more, than their ears. And this work is being led by Dr. Genevieve Mountain, who's a postdoc in our lab. And what Jen is finding is there's almost as many frogs that have lost their vocal sacs as there are frogs that have lost their ears. And there's about 50 of these frogs that have lost both. So that's not all the earless frogs. There's plenty of frogs that don't have ears but still call and still make these noises. But for some of these earless species, calling just might not be as important to them. Using sound communication might not be as important as we assume it is. There's also other ways that frogs are picking up on things in their environment and communicating with one another. So some of these, you all raised your hands that you communicate in other ways with each other. So big ones that we know frogs are using that we were kind of ignoring because we were spending so much time paying attention to what was most obvious to us, that they call to one another. So some frogs we're now learning are using a lot of vision. So they're actually active during the day, which is pretty weird for frogs, and they'll do these little waves to one another to get each other's attention. So some use their arms to do these cute little waves, and some use their legs. And I challenge you to try this leg wave, which we call foot flagging, when I'm done with this talk. Yeah, thank you in the back, I like that. We also learned in doing this work that frogs are really sensitive to vibration. So this is another way we think some individuals are communicating. So we can actually do these hearing tests, just like we did for sound, but we can actually do it with a vibration platform to understand how sensitive they are to vibrations. And what I can tell you, the easiest way to communicate this is your iPhone or your whatever smartphone you have, the frequency at which that buzzes, it feels like a 6G earthquake to a frog. That's how sensitive they are. And there are some frogs, and some of these earless frogs, that out in the field, when we're going and looking at them, they get up on leaves, and then they call to one another. And so it's really hard to send a signal to your friend via vibration, by stomping on the ground. It's really hard for those signals to travel. But if you tap on something like a leaf, that leaf's going to vibrate really violently, and then they can, you can even send signals kind of across an entire plant to your friend. Snakes also use this too. It's just another story for another day, but I thought I'd point out this is a really big way snakes also sense things in their environment. And then finally, and this is the one we know the least about, but it's really cool new research that lots of people are actively working on, is frogs are smelling a lot of things in their environment. And one cool story about this is right here, actually on the vocal sac, you can see that little yellow patch. So that was thought to be mainly a visual signal, so that when they make the call, this yellow patch stood out. But actually, it's full of these kind of volatile smells. And so when they are making these calls, they're actually also sending all these like pungent chemical signals to each other that they're actually smelling, maybe even more than they're hearing each other. Here's this one or before I started to bother it was calling its to this one right there. You see the other one sitting there at the bottom. So just calling right at it. Okay, and then finally, there's another cool thing we've learned from these frogs, and here comes the video I promised of that pumpkin toadlet. So some of these earless frogs are getting very small. So something cool that frogs do is they get very, very small. So this, Sarah McKay, who's going to be back doing some acoustic work later, is holding a frog from our lab. So this is one that just turned from a tadpole into a frog, and it's going to actually get very big, but it starts off that small. And here's another one that I picked up in the field. But these frogs are actually going to get pretty big as they grow up. Some frogs never get big, and they stay super small the whole time. They never get big. And this actually has, researchers think, really big consequences on their ears. So some of these frogs, their ears also get so small that they don't work as well, and actually they lose their balance. And so you're going to see this very small frog and how it jumps, but more importantly, how it lands. Very dramatic. It does not land very well, and it just kind of bounces around. And it's thought that they're so bad at this because their ears are so small that they just can't balance. So they can take off pretty well, but it goes downhill from there. Okay, so just to wrap this up, our lab studies a lot of things. Earless frogs is one, but why do we do this? So I just want to reiterate, one thing we've learned a lot, and I didn't talk about all the things we've learned about hearing, but we've learned a lot about how hearing works, not just in frogs, but also hearing mechanisms that we use to better hearing technologies like bone conduction hearing aids and things. A lot of that research is done in organisms that aren't us, including frogs. And I will say that in the back table, I'm going to have kind of a setup so that you can listen to different music and things like an eared and earless frog, if you want to chat more about hearing. They also teach us about communication, and I think the biggest take home is that other organisms are sensing their world really differently than how we sense it. And so they teach us that it might seem weird to us that these frogs are losing their ear, but it might actually not be that weird for them because they're picking up on all sorts of other signals in their environment. And Sarah McKay Strobel is going to be in the back at a table by our booth, and she's going to have different ways that frogs communicate, and you can try your best to imitate basically what different frogs sound like, including those screaming frogs, if you want to give that a go. And we'll show you how we measure sound in the lab. And then finally, they teach us about evolution. So they teach us, again, what makes frogs all similar to one another, what are their really interesting and fascinating differences, and how are they changing over time in ways that we maybe don't predict or fully understand right now. And somewhat related to this, Jack's going to be again back there showing how we look very closely at our tadpoles and frogs with high-speed video to learn more about what they're doing in their world and what it means for how they survive. The cool thing about science is it is never done by a single person. It is done by a slew of people, and here's a bunch of people that helped me with this research. And I will be happy to take questions, or people can file out to do all the fun activities. These are just my dogs. Thanks for coming.
First question for Dr. Womack.
So, if the middle ear is missing in some of these frogs, does that improve relatively underwater sound, or is it also the same decrease?
So for the specifically hearing high frequencies, the ones that they don't hear as well on land, you mean? Yeah, so underwater it's pretty okay just because usually they're mainly paying attention to lower frequencies and they're kind of using almost like substrate vibration at that point. So we think it doesn't matter. What's really interesting is there are frogs that spend most of their time underwater, but there's about an equal number of those that have middle ears or don't have middle ears, and most of the frogs we see that don't have these middle ears, they're actually on land. So it would make a lot of sense if most earless frogs were the aquatic ones that spend most of their time in water, but that's not what we see. We see them basically mostly on land, which is crazy.
Question, good, you keep me running. That's what I like to do. Let's see, hand up here. Are you good, catch? Okay.
Can tadpoles live like anywhere just that has a lot of rain?
That's a great question. Tadpoles can live almost anywhere where there's fresh water. So they don't live in the oceans. That's somewhere frogs don't really do well, and they've never been really able to live in salty water. There are some that can live in kind of marshes that get kind of salty, but they don't do ocean. But they are found in basically all sorts of other little pools. Jack can tell you lots of cool stories, but they can even be found in really, really tiny cups of water in plants. Anywhere there's a little plop of fresh water, frogs probably can be and often are.
Okay, was there a question over here? Ready for a long toss? This is a Hail Mary.
I'm fine.
Okay. Now you can ask your questions, yeah.
I don't know what.
Do you remember which
You
question?
doesn't remember.
Frogs not live in Utah? Yes. In Logan, there's only about 4 different frogs, so not that many. But in Utah, there's more than 4. There's probably up to 10 or 11. But most of them live down south. Frogs tend to do a little bit better where it's warmer. So up here in Logan, we only have a few species. But they're totally here, yeah.
Ready?
This is cool. I have two questions.
Yeah.
First of all is like the, let's say, trait of like missing hearing organs in frogs. Is it like a spontaneous mutation, or is it like the result of like slow evolution through a long period of time? And second of all, if they're like 1 sense less, then how come they're thriving as well, or maybe even better than frogs with hearing?
Two great questions. You should join my lab. The mutation question. So, I mean, the biggest thing to say about that is we don't know. We think it's kind of a gradual thing, but we don't know the exact genetic mechanism of why they're losing their ears, and whether that's kind of a slow process or a really fast process. The one thing I can say about it is that frogs actually start to develop those middle ears. So those earless frogs, they do start to develop them, and then they stop, and then they resorb it. So all the kind of genetic machinery and developmental machinery to start growing that ear is still there. But something's happening in later development, and so we don't know exactly, but that to me points that it might be something more like a gradual loss. And then the second question was, why are earless frogs doing so well? That is the 10-year question that I've kind of been investigating with these. And I mean, in some it does seem like they just are doing other things, and so it doesn't matter so much that they're losing their ears. The one thing that's interesting about frogs is it seems like this should be really bad for them, because it should be harder for them to hear predators. But the things that are mainly eating frogs, so everything eats a frog basically that can put it in its mouth. Frogs are like tasty snacks on the landscape is how I describe them. But mostly it's snakes, which are mostly on the ground and not making noise. Bats, which call super, super high frequencies that the frogs can't hear anyways. Or kind of other spiders, other things that are, it's easier to actually see them coming or hear them coming by vibration. So it might just be that we think this hearing is so important, but for frogs, it just might not be the most important thing for them. Yeah.
Okay, I've got a hard job here. See, a lot of hands from a lot of really cute kids, but I saw some really, and I'm not going to use it over here because you guys are older. It would be inappropriate, but you've had your hand up for a while, so you ready? Let's see, I'm going to actually bring this up with that laptop there.
Do frogs have teeth?
No. That's a good question.
Are there any species of frogs that have teeth?
Yes. Actually? Yes. So, most frogs actually do have teeth, and they can have them on the bottom or the upper jaw. And then also, tadpoles, I wish I had a photo, have their own vicious set of teeth that actually they have, and then they lose those, and then they gain new teeth as frogs. But I will say, teeth are also something that over evolutionary time frogs have lost nearly as much. And there's a cool paper on that. But yeah, that's another thing that they lose a lot. Yeah.
Okay, you had yours. Ready? You good, Catch? Okay.
Can you eat frog eggs?
Oh, eggs. You definitely can. As far as I know, I've never heard of that being bad for anyone. I don't think they would be particularly tasty, but you could eat them. The other thing about frog eggs is sometimes they're in this really, really sticky kind of like jelly substance that keeps them safe, and I gotta say that can't taste good, and it would be hard to get the eggs out. But you're welcome to try. I don't think it would kill you. But I don't recommend it, and I will not condone that.
Now, you've had your hand up for a while. Here.
What do they eat?
What do frogs eat? Great question. Frogs eat basically anything that they can fit in their mouth and catch. Usually that's ants and small bugs, but they'll eat anything, including other frogs. Yeah, anything that they can catch. And there are some really big frogs that'll eat even a mouse.
Okay, ready?
So you know that thing that like expands underneath the frog's throat
Yeah.
and it croaks? What would happen if it like popped or like got a hole in it?
I think this all the time because some of them are so thin. It seems It's incredible they don't get injured more. And I've actually never, in all the frogs I've seen one with a vocal sac that's popped. So they're made of these like particular structures that are, even though they're so thin, they are incredibly strong, and they're also, as soon as something comes near the frog, they deflate them and they pull them back up. So I think it's just not exposed very often. But yeah, it's a good question. I think it too.
Let's see. Again, I have a lot of hands. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go over here, then I'll come back, okay? Let's see. Are you a good catch? Okay, let's see how good a tosser I am. Ready?
Is global warming any effect on the frogs?
Wow, that's a great question. Yeah, so definitely global warming is having an effect on frogs. And in a lot of different ways. So one, it can get too hot and too dry in certain places, and frogs lose a lot of water through their skin, and so that's tough. The other thing is frogs have a lot of diseases that are currently affecting a ton of different species all over the world, and as temperatures get warmer, some of those diseases spread further, and so that's another really big issue. Yeah, that's a great question.
Do you also study toads, or is that a different school, and what's the difference there?
Fantastic question. I like this question a lot. So toads are just a type of frog. So in fact, I mostly have studied toads, and I've kind of like trained myself as I've gotten into other groups to try to say frog instead of toad. Glad I did a good job, since I made it seem like I study so many more things than toads. But yeah, toads are just a type of frog, and to answer your question of what's different about them, they're just a particular group of frogs, and actually, even though we think of them as being warty or like being kind of bigger, they're completely identical. They're species that I could show you that are true toads, and you would not be able to guess that they're a toad versus a frog. So toads are just frogs. It's like square rectangle. Yeah.
Okay, I promised 10 minutes of questions. We're close to 10 minutes, but I see a lot of hands. Let's do another couple of questions. Let's see, I'd love to get to everybody. I haven't, let's see, somebody waving their hand way back, and I see you guys down here, but I've been in this group for a long time, and I'm sorry. Let's have it. Let me, because I'm right here, I'll get to you next, I promise.
Do tadpoles have ears?
Ooh, good question. Tadpoles have the inner ear part, but they don't have that middle ear because you don't need it as much underwater. It's really a land hearing thing, that middle ear. So that's a great question.
Okay, so way back there, somebody really waving their hand. Ready? This is another long.
No, wait, he gets that. Okay. Are there any birds that would want to eat a frog?
Definitely. I think there are some frogs that don't taste good and can definitely give animals that eat them pretty bad tummy aches. But a lot of frogs are eaten by almost everything eats a frog. They are small. They can be pretty easy to catch, and birds definitely eat them.
Okay.
Do frogs have taste buds on their tongues? And if so, what taste can they recognize?
Yes, that is such a good question. This is a really active area of research. They do have taste buds. I've seen them myself. You can come to our lab and see the little taste buds on the tongue. But what do they taste? I don't know the answer to that, but there was a really brand new study that came out super recently that tried to look at this in different frogs. We definitely don't know what all frogs are tasting. I do know that they can taste bitter things, definitely frogs can taste, but I'm not so sure about things like sweet or salty. Yeah, that's a great question.
Okay, here we go. Ready? Do you want to catch? Let me bring it to you. Catch, okay. Here we go, look at it.
How long could frogs live?
Oh, that's a good question. So some frogs, I think the longest frog that's ever been recorded to live is something around 30 years. That was in captivity. I think it's a hard life for a frog out in the world, but I think 30 years might be kind of like the reigning champion right now. But most frogs maybe live closer to anywhere from 4 to 7 years. Yeah.
Long shot here.
Okay, so you said that like some frogs like lose like their hearing and their vocals.
Yeah.
I was wondering like the ones that still have their vocals but don't have their hearing, like are they more likely to speak in lower like pitches like you were saying?
Yeah, so the ones that don't lose their vocals but have lost their ear, yes, that's a great question. We also wondered this, are they just calling at those lower frequencies that they can still hear just as well? And it's the exact opposite. All the earless frogs call at high frequencies, specifically at the ones they can't hear as well. It just makes no sense. It's so fun.
How does bad hearing contribute to a bad landing for a frog?
Oh, that's a great question. So it's related, but not the same mechanism. So in those frogs that don't land so well, it's actually some of their inner ear, which is kind of the yellow part that even the earless frogs have. It's kind of, if you looked at it, the best way I could describe it is it's a little bit smushed. It's gotten so small that parts of it are kind of smushed, and the kind of machinery and hair cells inside of it that help you balance and understand kind of where you are in the world, help you orient, they are not working as well, but scientists don't know exactly how. So they think it has to do with the fact that kind of the way it looks is pretty smushed, and then this is having some effect on how you perceive the world. But the researchers that are looking at that, they don't know the exact mechanism yet. Yeah, it's just a hypothesis we have.
So you said that the patch in the vocal cord was the thing that was letting out all the smells.
Yeah.
So if they didn't have the vocal, then would they still be able to communicate with smells, or would they just not have that?
Yeah, so the smelling world of frogs is still, like taste, something we don't know a lot about. If anyone wants to come work on frog senses, it is like, there's so much we don't know. But we're learning more and more about how frogs smell, and something that I'll just tell you is some frogs just smell funny. So there are certain frogs and even tadpoles that you can pick up, and they smell like peanut butter. So we know that some frogs have really distinct smells that even we can pick up. That probably means most frogs have some sort of smell. And recently there's this cool study that showed that in this one species, these frogs are keeping particular bacteria on their skin, and it lets them know which ones are male and which ones are female. They have particular bacteria, and they are eliciting all this smell just from their skin, from bacteria that they keep on. So I'm guessing most frogs are smelly, and we're probably not smelling all their smells. The peanut butter ones, yes, very interesting. But I think most frogs probably have other ways. And this cool vocal patch, that just allows the smell to go really, really far when they call, but I think all frogs smell.
Any others? Okay, let's see. I told you, let's see. No, because actually we'll pick it up. Ready?
The assist.
As a little boy, I noticed living in the tropics that some frogs are very dry, some are very slimy, some frogs would emit stuff the minute you touch them. What was that, just all defense mechanisms, or the slimy part was just they're always slimy from the environment?
Yeah, these are great questions. You should also come work in my lab. We're really interested in frog skin right now. We're interested in it because frogs breathe through it, but then they lose all that water. And so sometimes that slimy stuff are waxy coatings that keep water in, kind of like a thick sunscreen or something, or a thick mud bath. But then, yeah, some frog and toad skin is really dry to the touch. And so we don't know. It's actually, despite the fact frogs are it's like one of their main features that they can breathe through their skin. We don't actually know what frog skin looks like between frogs. We know a lot about skin in a couple of species. one of which lives mostly underwater. But land-living frogs, we actually know really little about even what their skin looks like when you look up close. And so I wish I should have put a slide up there, but yeah, my lab's looking at that now to try to understand what are those differences that we can clearly see, or feel when we pick them up. And then also, how does that affect how they breathe and how they lose water? So next time I come back, I'll have an answer for you on that, I hope.
Okay, time for one more, if there is one more. Okay, ready?
How much water does a frog really need to survive?
That's a good question. Lots of water, but like us, we're mostly water. It's something like 70% water. Frogs also a lot of water. And so mainly their problem is keeping it in. So they're really good at sucking it up. Actually, frogs, a lot of them have these special bellies, and they're really, really thin. They have very special skin at that part of their body, and it just soaks up water. And then the whole trick for frogs is keeping it inside their body and not losing it. And so frogs also lose it. If you ever pick up a frog or toad, it might pee on you, so that's another big way that they lose water. They also use that as a predator defense. But they'll quickly try to replenish that water, and if they lose too much, they'll get very sad very fast. If you've ever kept a pet frog at home and it's gotten out of its container, you'll know how quickly that sad day can come.
Okay, I want to thank Dr. Womack again for a great talk, a great set of answers.